Hello, my friend. Just a couple days ago, I dropped a video, it's linked below, that suggested kicking NDs to the curb for action camera video, specifically the DJI Osmo Action 4 or 5, to enhance image stability, reduce visible jitters, and reduce rolling shutter. I received a few comments suggesting the use of gyroflow to keep the camera settings to a shutter speed at twice the frame rate and therefore retain natural motion blur. However, when looking at the gyroflow website, they recommend not using motion blur footage with gyroflow. Instead, they recommend the use of a plugin called Real Smart Motion Blur, RSMB, to add motion blur in post. In the No NDs video that I posted, I tried a very slight addition of post-production motion blur with Pixel Film Studio's free motion blur plugin, and admittedly, could only use a very slight amount because it does quickly start to look quite unnatural. So, let's take a look at the Real Smart Motion Blur tool to add motion blur in post so that we can keep the auto exposure settings on the DJI Osmo Action 4 to maximize stability and reduce the possibility of jittery footage or rolling shutter. First, we'll compare standard in-camera motion blur by using the DJI Osmo Pocket 3 mounted on the Tilta Hydra Alien Mini with the camera set at 24 frames per second and 1/50 shutter speed. This is the motion blur we're trying to achieve. And here's the same footage with auto exposure on the DJI Osmo Action 4. Really no motion blur. I tried to mount the cameras as close to each other as possible, but this is the best I could get with the Alien Mini arm. Now, let's take the Osmo Action 4 footage head-mounted that you're watching now and apply the Real Smart Motion Blur tool right now. What do you think? Natural? Unnatural? Here's a split screen with the Osmo Action 4 head-mounted on auto exposure on the left and the Real Smart Motion Blur added on the right. I think this really shows how much difference motion blur, even if artificial, can make on the footage. This is probably not great to watch on your phone, but here we'll side by side similar footage taken with the Osmo Pocket 3 with shutter speed at twice the frame rate compared to the Action 4 with Real Smart Motion Blur. Any thoughts here? Lastly, let's look at a freeze frame of both the Real Smart Motion Blur compared to the Pixel Film Studio Motion Blur, and there's really no comparison. The artificiality of the Pixel Film Studio Motion Blur is quite clear, while the RSMB Motion Blur is artificial on a freeze frame, but definitely more subtle and much more natural. Here's a final product with a bit of color grading and the motion blur added. What I really like is that RSMB seems to distinguish depth in the shot and doesn't blur distant objects while only applying blur to areas closest to the center of movement where you'd expect to see the most natural motion blur. I'm really happy with these results, and I appreciate the gyroflow website steering me towards the RSMB plugin. Is it a perfect match to real motion blur? No. But it definitely lets me confidently capture jittery-free footage on the DJI Osmo Action and transform it to better match footage from other cameras and scenes in a video. And that's a wrap on this one. What do you think? Is post-production motion blur overly artificial for you? Does gyroflow still seem the best option for retaining the best looking and most natural footage? Drop a comment below and let me know. Please don't hesitate to subscribe, like this video if you feel so inclined, and as always, crush your ego, inflate yourself, follow your intuition, and find your every day.